Janitor didn't know he was being watched by undercover owner when he left meal for night shift cook. The fluorescent lights of Riverside Grill buzzed like angry wasps at 11:47 p.m., casting harsh shadows across the empty dining room. Daniel Reed pushed his mop bucket between the tables with the careful precision of a man who understood that second chances don't come with third opportunities. At 45, his weathered hands moved with quiet efficiency, each stroke of the mop erasing the day's evidence of laughter, spilled coffee, and forgotten conversations. 8 months. That's how long it had been since he'd walked out of Millfield Correctional, carrying nothing but a paper bag of belongings and a determination to disappear into the kind of honest work that kept your head down and your record clean. The graveyard shift at this upscale downtown diner was perfect for both requirements. Daniel had learned the art of invisibility long before prison. Growing up in Detroit's East Side had taught him that survival often meant becoming a ghost, seen but not noticed, present but not remembered. The skill had served him well inside, and it served him even better now. The day's shift barely knew his name. Management saw him as just another uniform mopping floors and emptying trash. That's exactly how he wanted it. But tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made the hair on his neck stand up like a dog sensing a storm. In the kitchen, Elena Morales wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her sleeve, leaving a streak of flour across her brown skin. At 23, she moved with the exhausted grace of someone who'd been working since she was old enough to reach a stovetop. The night shift at Riverside was her second job. Her first was the morning shift at a bakery across town. Between the two, she managed maybe 4 hours of sleep and sent every spare dollar to her mother and younger siblings back in Phoenix. Another late night for both of us, she murmured to herself, prepping vegetables for tomorrow's lunch special. Her stomach growled loudly enough to echo off the stainless steel walls, but she ignored it. The employee meal policy was strict. Staff could eat only designated leftovers, and there weren't any tonight. Again. Elena had perfected the art of running on empty. Coffee, determination, and the occasional energy bar when she could afford it. She'd been doing this dance for 2 years now, ever since her father's construction accident left him unable to work. The family needed her income more than she needed regular meals. What neither Daniel nor Elena knew was that they were being watched. Christopher Lane sat hunched over a sink full of dishes, his usually manicured hands now wrinkled and pruned from the hot dishwater. For 3 weeks, he'd been, Chris, just another face in the rotating cast of dishwashers that seemed to come and go from Riverside Grill like autumn leaves. The fake goatee itched terribly, and the colored contact lenses made his eyes water, but the disguise was holding. At 38, Christopher had built Riverside Grill from a failing diner into the most successful restaurant in downtown Portland. He'd clawed his way up from nothing, sleeping in his car during culinary school, working 3 jobs to afford ingredients for his own recipes, learning the hard way that success in the restaurant business was 10% inspiration and 90% pure stubborn refusal to quit. But lately, something was wrong. Profits were down, staff turnover was through the roof, and he'd been hearing whispers about low morale and unfair treatment. His day managers assured him everything was fine, but the numbers told a different story. So Christopher had done what any good businessman would do. He'd gone undercover to see the truth for himself. 3 weeks in, and he was beginning to suspect the problem wasn't what he'd expected. He'd anticipated finding lazy employees, theft, or corner-cutting that was hurting the business. Instead, he'd discovered a night shift that worked harder than any crew he'd ever seen. They covered for each other's mistakes, stayed late without complaint, and maintained the kind of standards that had made Riverside Grill's reputation in the first place. But they were barely surviving. Christopher watched Elena through the kitchen's pass-through window as she swayed slightly on her feet. When was the last time he'd seen her eat? He'd been tracking the staff's habits for weeks now, and he couldn't remember a single instance of Elena taking a proper meal break. The realization hit him like a slap. His own policies were slowly starving his best employees. Daniel finished mopping the dining room and wheeled his bucket toward the kitchen. Christopher had been watching the janitor too, trying to figure out what made him different from the parade of temporary workers who usually took the night cleaning jobs. Most lasted a week, maybe two, before the isolation and physical demands drove them away. Daniel had been here for 8 months, never missing a shift, never complaining, never causing problems. There was something in the way Daniel moved, careful, deliberate, like a man who understood that attention was dangerous. Christopher recognized it because he'd felt it himself, years ago, when every day was a fight to prove you belonged somewhere better than where you'd started. As Daniel passed through the kitchen, he glanced at Elena's prep station. She was in the walk-in cooler, gathering ingredients for tomorrow's soup. Her purse sat open on the counter, and Christopher could see the contents from his position at the dish pit: a nearly empty wallet, a bus pass, and a photo of what looked like a family with several children. Daniel stopped. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still, looking at Elena's workspace. Then, with movements so quick and quiet that Christopher almost missed them, Daniel reached into his own jacket pocket and pulled out a brown paper bag. He placed it carefully next to Elena's cutting board and continued on his way as if nothing had happened. Christopher's hands stilled in the dishwater. What had he just witnessed? Elena emerged from the cooler, arms full of vegetables, and immediately spotted the paper bag. She set down the vegetables and opened it carefully, as if it might contain something fragile. Inside was a peanut butter sandwich, cut diagonally, wrapped in plastic wrap, and a red apple that had been polished until it gleamed under the kitchen lights. Christopher watched her face transform. The exhaustion didn't disappear, but something softer took its place: surprise, gratitude, and a kind of wonder that someone had thought of her. She looked around the empty kitchen, but Daniel had already disappeared into the storage room. Elena bit into the sandwich and closed her eyes, savoring not just the food but the kindness behind it. She didn't know who her mysterious benefactor was, but in that moment, she felt less alone than she had in months. From his spot at the dish pit, Christopher felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition he wasn't prepared for. He'd come here looking for problems to solve, inefficiencies to eliminate, people to blame for his falling profits. Instead, he just witnessed something that made him question everything he thought he knew about leadership. The janitor, a man whose name Christopher wasn't even sure he knew, had just given away what was probably his only meal. Not for recognition, not for reward, but simply because he noticed someone was hungry. When was the last time Christopher had noticed if his employees were hungry? As Daniel emerged from the storage room and continued his rounds, Christopher found himself studying the man with new eyes. There was a story there, written in the careful way Daniel avoided eye contact and the practiced invisibility of his movements. Christopher had built his success on reading people, on understanding what motivated them, what they needed, what they feared. What he saw in Daniel Reed was a man who understood that kindness was a luxury he couldn't afford, and chose it anyway. The night stretched ahead of them, full of the usual routines and unspoken struggles. But something had changed in those few minutes when a janitor left a sandwich for a cook who forgot to eat. Christopher just didn't know yet how much. 3 nights later, the pattern repeated itself with the precision of a well-choreographed dance, though none of the dancers realized they were performing for an audience. Daniel Reed arrived at Riverside Grill at exactly 11:30 p.m., just as he had every night for the past 8 months. His routine was sacred: punch in, gather supplies, start with the restrooms, work his way through the dining room, finish in the kitchen. But tonight, like the previous 2 nights, he carried something extra in his jacket pocket. The brown paper bag crinkled softly as he moved, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Inside was the same meal he'd packed for himself every day since leaving Millfield Correctional: a peanut butter sandwich on day-old bread he bought discounted from the bakery down the street, and whatever piece of fruit he could afford. Tonight it was another apple, this one slightly bruised but still good. It should have been his dinner. It should have been the fuel that got him through 6 hours of mopping, scrubbing, and trying to remain invisible. But Daniel had noticed something that apparently no one else had. Elena Morales was slowly disappearing. Not literally, though some nights she seemed translucent under the harsh kitchen lights. But she was getting thinner, moving slower, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion so deep it had settled into her bones. Last night, he'd watched her sway while standing at the prep station, catching herself on the counter with a grip that turned her knuckles white. Christopher Lane, still disguised as Chris the dishwasher, had been watching too. For 3 weeks now, he'd been cataloging every interaction, every shortcut, every violation of policy that might explain his restaurant's declining performance. What he'd found instead was a night shift that worked with the dedication of people who understood that failure meant losing everything. But he'd also found something else, something that made his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Elena stumbled slightly as she carried a heavy stock pot to the stove, and Christopher instinctively started to move toward her before catching himself. He couldn't blow his cover, not when he was finally seeing the truth about what happened when the sun went down at Riverside Grill. Daniel had been cleaning the men's restroom when he heard Elena's soft gasp from the kitchen. He'd poked his head through the doorway just in time to see her steady herself against the prep table, one hand pressed to her stomach. The sound it made, a hollow, desperate rumble, carried clearly across the empty space. She looked around quickly, checking to make sure no one had noticed, then returned to her prep work with the kind of determination that came from years of pushing through discomfort. Daniel recognized it because he'd lived it, both inside and out here in the world where second chances came with conditions and fine print. Storage room inventory. Elena muttered to herself, grabbing a clipboard and heading toward the walk-in cooler. It was her nightly ritual, checking supplies, noting what needed to be ordered, buying herself a few minutes of privacy where no one could see if her hands shook from hunger. Daniel waited until she disappeared behind the heavy door, then moved with the silent efficiency that had kept him alive in places where noise could be dangerous. The paper bag emerged from his jacket pocket, and for just a moment, he hesitated. This was his food. His only meal until he got home at dawn and could afford to eat the single can of soup that would carry him through his few hours of sleep. Giving it away meant going hungry, meant feeling that familiar hollow ache that reminded him of the worst times, before and during his incarceration. But Elena's soft gasp echoed in his memory, and Daniel's choice was made before his conscious mind caught up. He placed the bag carefully beside Elena's knife roll, positioned so she'd see it immediately upon returning. Then he melted back into the dining room like smoke, leaving no trace of his kindness except the gift itself. From his position at the dish pit, Christopher watched this exchange with growing amazement. He'd positioned himself specifically to observe the night shift's work habits, expecting to catch someone stealing food or violating health codes. Instead, he was witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about human nature. The janitor, Daniel, he'd finally learned the man's name from the time clock, had just given away what was clearly his only meal. Again. This wasn't a one-time gesture of charity. It was a deliberate, repeated sacrifice that spoke to something deeper than simple kindness. Elena emerged from the storage room, saw the bag, and her entire posture changed. The exhaustion didn't leave her face, but something else joined it, a softness, a moment of wonder that someone had noticed her need. She opened the bag with the reverence of someone unwrapping a precious gift, and when she saw the sandwich and apple, her eyes actually filled with tears. She didn't look around to identify her benefactor. She was too tired for investigation, too hungry for anything but gratitude. She simply whispered, "Thank you," to the empty kitchen and bit into the sandwich with the kind of appreciation that comes from unexpected grace. Christopher felt something crack open inside his chest. He'd built his business on metrics, on profit margins and efficiency ratings. He'd measured success in dollars earned and costs cut, in tables turned and customer satisfaction scores. But watching Elena's face as she ate that simple sandwich, he realized he'd been measuring the wrong things entirely. For the first time in years, Christopher Lane questioned not just his policies, but his assumptions about the people who worked for him. He'd come here looking for theft and laziness, for explanations that would justify the tough decisions he'd been making. Instead, he'd found something that made him wonder when he'd stopped seeing his employees as human beings with their own struggles and dreams. The night stretched ahead, full of questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. Over the next 5 nights, Christopher Lane learned more about leadership than he had in 15 years of running restaurants. It started with the sink. Tuesday night, 2:17 a.m. The ancient pipes beneath the prep station chose the worst possible moment to surrender, sending a steady stream of greasy water across the kitchen floor just as Elena was trying to finish the morning's soup base. She stared at the growing puddle with the kind of exhaustion that makes small problems feel catastrophic. "Great," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the steady drip. "Just perfect." Christopher, elbow deep in his dishwashing charade, calculated the cost of an emergency plumber call versus waiting until morning. The practical part of his brain, the part that had built Riverside Grill from nothing, immediately started running numbers. Emergency service calls were expensive. The kitchen could function with one less prep sink until the day's shift arrived. But Daniel Reed appeared in the kitchen doorway like he materialized from the shadows, took one look at the spreading water, and disappeared into the storage room. He returned with a wrench, a bucket, and the kind of focused determination that spoke of experience with things that broke at inconvenient times. "I can fix this," he said quietly to Elena, already kneeling beside the sink. "Won't take long." Christopher watched, transfixed, as Daniel crawled under the prep station and began working with the methodical patience of someone who understood that broken things could be made whole again, given enough care and the right touch. Within 20 minutes the leak was stopped, the floor was mopped, and Elena was back to her soup preparation. Daniel didn't ask for overtime pay. He didn't file a maintenance request. He didn't even mention it to anyone. He simply saw something broken and fixed it, because that's what needed to be done. Wednesday night brought the delivery truck incident. The regular driver had called in sick, leaving a substitute who looked like he never lifted anything heavier than a coffee cup. 3 cases of canned goods sat on the loading dock while the young man struggled with the dolly, clearly in over his head. Christopher watched from the kitchen window as Daniel finished emptying the dining room trash and noticed the situation. Without hesitation, he walked over and began helping load the heavy cases, his movements efficient despite the obvious strain on his 45-year-old back. "You didn't have to do that," the driver said, genuine gratitude in his voice. Daniel just shrugged. "We all need help sometimes." It was such a simple statement, but it hit Christopher like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd helped someone simply because they needed it? When had he stopped seeing struggles and started seeing only profit margins? Thursday night, Christopher watched Daniel clean up a mess that wasn't his responsibility. Broken glass from a wine bottle that had slipped from Elena's tired hands during the dinner rush cleanup. Instead of reporting it or leaving it for the morning crew, Daniel appeared with a broom and dustpan, carefully collecting every shard while Elena apologized profusely. "Happens to everyone," Daniel said softly. "No harm done." But Christopher knew there was harm done, to his bottom line, to his efficiency metrics, to the cold calculus that had driven every decision he made for the past decade. Daniel's kindness was a rebuke to everything Christopher had convinced himself was necessary to succeed. Lying in his penthouse apartment each morning after his undercover shifts, Christopher found himself remembering things he tried hard to forget. Growing up in a trailer park outside Bakersfield, watching his mother work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Sleeping in his beat-up Honda during culinary school because he couldn't afford both tuition and rent. The crushing weight of debt, and the constant fear that one mistake would send him back to the poverty he'd fought so hard to escape. He'd clawed his way up through sheer determination and an absolute refusal to fail. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten what it felt like to be the person who needed help instead of the person with the power to give it. The policies he'd implemented, strict meal restrictions, limited break times, zero tolerance for mistakes, had seemed reasonable from his executive suite. They were designed to maintain standards, control costs, and ensure profitability. But watching Daniel's quiet generosity night after night, Christopher began to see his rules through different eyes. Elena couldn't afford to eat the food she spent her nights preparing. Daniel was giving away his own meals to keep a coworker from starving. The night crew was holding the restaurant together with duct tape and determination, while Christopher counted pennies from his corner office. Friday night, Christopher made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of maintaining his dishwashing station, he began observing more actively, moving through the restaurant to understand not just what his employees were doing, but why they were doing it. He watched Elena choose between buying ingredients for staff meals and keeping the kitchen stocked with essentials, always choosing the business over her own needs. He saw Daniel work through what was obviously a painful back injury, never complaining, never asking for accommodations. He witnessed a dozen small sacrifices that his day managers either didn't see or didn't think were worth reporting. By Saturday night, Christopher Lane was facing a truth that made him profoundly uncomfortable. He had become exactly the kind of boss he'd once sworn he'd never be. Successful, yes. Profitable, absolutely. But somewhere in his climb to the top, he'd forgotten that success without compassion was just another form of poverty. The question now was what he intended to do about it. The first shift on Monday night felt different the moment Daniel walked through Riverside Grill's back entrance. There was a new energy in the air, sharp, predatory, and dangerous in the way that made his survival instincts scream warnings. Standing near the time clock was a woman he'd never seen before, mid-40s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She wore the crisp white shirt and black slacks of management, and she was studying every person who walked past her with the intensity of someone conducting an inspection. "You must be Daniel," she said as he approached the time clock, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of wielding power over people who couldn't fight back. "I'm Patricia Hoffman, the new night supervisor. I'll be overseeing operations from now on." Daniel nodded quietly, keeping his head down as he punched in. But he could feel her eyes on him, cataloging details, making connections he desperately hoped she wouldn't make. Patricia had been hired that afternoon by Christopher's day manager, who'd assured him that she would whip the night shift into shape. She came with impressive credentials, 15 years managing restaurant crews, a reputation for efficiency, and the kind of no-nonsense approach that corporate loved. What the day manager hadn't mentioned was Patricia's previous job at a diner near the state prison, where she developed an encyclopedic knowledge of local ex-convicts and a deep suspicion of anyone with a criminal past. Christopher, still maintaining his dishwasher disguise, watched the introduction with growing unease. Something about Patricia's demeanor set off alarms he'd learned to trust during his own difficult years. She had the look of someone who enjoyed having power over people who couldn't defend themselves. For the first 2 hours, everything seemed normal. Patricia made rounds, taking notes, asking pointed questions about procedures and efficiency. She criticized Elena's prep timing, questioned Daniel's cleaning methods, and generally created the kind of hostile environment that made everyone nervous. But it was during her third round that disaster struck. Daniel was emptying trash in the manager's office when Patricia walked in, carrying a stack of paperwork. On the wall behind the desk was a corkboard where the previous manager had pinned various notices, including a collection of photos from the security company's monthly newsletter, wanted posters, arrest photos, and community alerts. Patricia's eyes swept across the board automatically, the way someone in her position learned to do. Then they stopped. Her head tilted slightly, comparing the face in one of the older mugshots to the man she just met at the time clock. Well, she murmured, pulling the photo from the board. "Daniel Reed. Aggravated attack, 5 years at Millfield. What are the odds?" From the dining room, Christopher heard the change in Patricia's voice and moved closer to the office, staying hidden behind the kitchen's pass-through window. What he heard next made his blood run cold. Patricia walked straight to the kitchen, where Daniel was refilling his cleaning supplies. She held up the mugshot with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Interesting reading material in the office," she said loudly enough for Elena to hear. "Amazing how people try to reinvent themselves, isn't it? But the past has a way of catching up." Daniel's face went white. The spray bottle in his hand trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I disclosed my record when I was hired. Everything was approved through corporate." "Oh, I'm sure it was," Patricia said with mock sweetness. "But I wonder if they knew about the details. Violent offender, weren't you? Aggravated attack. That's not exactly the kind of person we want around food service, is it? Elena, who had been quietly chopping vegetables, set down her knife and turned toward them. What's going on? Just getting acquainted with our janitor's colorful history, Patricia said, clearly enjoying the moment. I think corporate might be very interested to know that their background check process let a violent criminal slip through. Christopher felt his chest tighten with rage and something deeper, a recognition of injustice that reminded him uncomfortably of his own past struggles. He could end this with a phone call. One word from the owner would send Patricia packing and protect Daniel's job. But revealing his identity now would blow 3 weeks of careful observation and potentially damage his ability to make the larger changes his restaurant desperately needed. The moral calculus was brutal. Save one man now, or maintain his cover to help everyone later. Elena walked around the prep station, moving closer to Daniel with the kind of quiet determination that had gotten her through 2 years of 18-hour days. I don't know what happened in the past, she said, her voice calm but firm. But I know what I've seen. Someone's been leaving me food every night for weeks. Someone fixed our sink without being asked. Someone helps people because it's the right thing to do. She looked directly at Daniel, and there was no fear in her eyes, only understanding. That was you, wasn't it? The sandwiches? Daniel met her gaze for the first time since Patricia's revelation, and slowly nodded. Then I know exactly what kind of person you are, Elena said, turning to face Patricia. And it's not what you're suggesting. Patricia's smile faltered slightly. You're defending a convicted felon. Do you even know what he did? I know what he's doing now, Elena replied. And that's all that matters to me. From his hiding place, Christopher watched this exchange with growing amazement. Elena, barely out of college and exhausted from working 2 jobs, was standing up to management to defend a man whose past she didn't even know. It was the kind of moral courage he'd once possessed but had somehow lost along his climb to success. Daniel's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but steady. I made a mistake when I was 22. A bad mistake that hurt someone and cost me 5 years of my life. But I've spent every day since trying to be better than I was. He looked at Elena with something that might have been gratitude, then back at Patricia. If you want to report me, that's your choice. But I've never lied about who I was or what I did. I just hoped I might be allowed to show who I'm trying to become. Patricia's triumph was complete. She had the power to destroy this man's second chance with a single phone call. All she had to do was use it. The question was whether Christopher Lane would let her. Christopher Lane had made a fortune by calculating risks and rewards, by weighing every decision against its potential impact on his bottom line. But standing in the shadows of his own kitchen, watching a power-hungry supervisor destroy a man's second chance for sport, he realized some decisions had nothing to do with profit margins. Patricia was reaching for her phone, her fingers already dialing what was undoubtedly corporate's emergency line, when Christopher stepped out from behind the pass-through window. That won't be necessary, he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the kitchen freeze. Patricia looked up, irritated at the interruption. Excuse me? This doesn't concern the dishwashing staff. Christopher reached up and peeled off the fake goatee, then removed the colored contact lenses with movements deliberate enough to draw everyone's attention. When he straightened up, the transformation was complete. Gone was Chris the dishwasher. In his place stood Christopher Lane, owner of Riverside Grill, his natural green eyes blazing with controlled fury. The phone slipped from Patricia's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor in the absolute silence that followed. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel stood frozen, confusion and dawning realization warring across his face. But Patricia went pale as she understood exactly how much trouble she was in. Mr. Lane, she stammered. I can explain. No need. Christopher cut her off, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that had closed million-dollar deals and ended careers. I've seen everything I need to see. You're fired. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. He pulled out his real phone and made a quick call. Within minutes, A security guard appeared to escort Patricia from the premises, her protests echoing down the hallway until the back door closed behind her with a satisfying bang. Christopher turned to face Daniel and Elena, both of whom were staring at him like he just materialized from another dimension. "Please," he said, his voice gentler now. "Sit down. Both of you. We need to talk." Elena sank onto a prep stool, her legs suddenly unsteady. Daniel remained standing, his posture tense with the wariness of a man who'd learned that authority figures rarely brought good news. "I owe you both an explanation," Christopher began, running a hand through his hair. 3 weeks ago, I came here undercover because I thought my night shift had problems. I expected to find theft, laziness, corner cutting. I thought I'd catch people violating policies or taking shortcuts. He looked directly at Daniel. Instead, I found someone giving away his only meal to make sure a coworker didn't go hungry. I watched you fix broken equipment without being asked, help people who needed it, and do a dozen small kindnesses that no one would ever know about. Daniel's confusion was evident. "You were watching me?" "I was watching everyone," Christopher admitted. "And what I saw made me realize that the problems with my restaurant weren't what I thought they were. The problem was me." He turned to Elena. "When was the last time you had a proper meal? Not a sandwich someone else gave you, but an actual meal that you chose for yourself?" Elena flushed, looking down at her hands. That's not important. It's the most important thing," Christopher said firmly. "I've been so focused on profit margins and efficiency that I forgot my employees are human beings with real needs. My policies have been slowly starving my best workers while I congratulated myself on keeping costs down." He began pacing, the energy of years of suppressed guilt and growing awareness finally finding an outlet. "Daniel, I heard what Patricia said about your past. I also heard what Elena said about who you are now. For 3 weeks, I've watched you choose kindness over self-preservation, generosity over survival. If that's not the kind of person I want working here, then I don't deserve to be in business." Daniel's voice, when he found it, was barely a whisper. "You're not going to fire me?" "Fire you?" Christopher laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm promoting you. Maintenance supervisor, full benefits, and a 30% raise. If you'll take it." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel swayed slightly, as if the words had physically impacted him. Christopher wasn't done. "Elena, I'm promoting you too. Head night cook, with the authority to hire an assistant. And starting tomorrow, there's a new policy. Every employee gets 1 free meal per shift. No exceptions, no restrictions. Food is fuel, and I've been running my people on empty." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Lane, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet," Christopher replied. "Because I'm not finished. I'm implementing a second chance hiring program. Background checks will focus on character and capability, not past mistakes. I'm also starting an employee assistance fund for people who need help with transportation, childcare, or emergency expenses." He looked around the kitchen that had become the site of his moral awakening. "This place taught me something important. Real leadership isn't about policies and profit margins. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, and creating an environment where they can thrive." Daniel finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Christopher smiled, and for the first time in years, it felt completely genuine. "Because 20 years ago, I was sleeping in my car and counting quarters for ramen. Because someone gave me a chance when I desperately needed one. And because watching you give away your dinner to help someone else reminded me who I used to be before I forgot that success without compassion is just expensive loneliness." Elena wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "The sandwiches, they saved me. More than just from hunger. They reminded me that people can be good. They reminded me too," Christopher said quietly. "And I intend to spend whatever time I have left making sure this place reflects that goodness." For the first time in 8 months, Daniel Reed stood up straight, his shoulders no longer carrying the weight of shame and fear. He'd found something he never expected to find again, a place where his past didn't define his future. The night shift at Riverside Grill would never be the same. 6 weeks later, Riverside Grill felt like a completely different place. The change wasn't visible in the dining room's polished tables or the kitchen's gleaming equipment. Those had always been spotless. The transformation lived in the spaces between words, and the way people moved through their shifts was something that had been missing for so long that many had forgotten what it felt like. Hope. Daniel Reed arrived for his shift at 11:30 p.m., just as he had for the past 9 months. But everything about his arrival had changed. Instead of slipping through the back door like a ghost trying not to be noticed, he walked in with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged somewhere. The nameplate on his uniform read, Daniel Reed, Maintenance Supervisor, and beneath it was a small pin that read, Second Chances Program. The program had been Christopher's idea, but Daniel had helped design it. Together, they'd created a pathway for people with criminal records to not just find work, but to rebuild their lives with dignity. It had been covered in 3 local newspapers and had already inspired 2 other restaurants to adopt similar policies. Elena Morales was finishing up the dinner prep when Daniel entered the kitchen. As head night cook, she now oversaw a staff of 4, including 2 new hires who worked with the kind of enthusiasm that came from fair wages and regular meals. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, replaced by the bright energy of someone who could finally afford to eat while working in a kitchen. Evening, Daniel, she called out, wiping her hands on her apron. The new kid is having trouble with the dishwasher again. 3rd time this week. Daniel nodded, grabbing his toolbox from the maintenance office that Christopher had set up specifically for him. It was a small space, but it was his, complete with a desk, filing cabinet, and a coffee maker that Elena had contributed from her first paycheck increase. The new kid was Marcus Thompson, 19 years old and 3 days out of a youth facility. He stood beside the industrial dishwasher looking overwhelmed and slightly panicked, water pooling at his feet from a machine that had chosen the dinner rush to stage a rebellion. It just started making this grinding noise, Marcus said, his voice tight with the fear of someone who couldn't afford to lose another job. I don't know what I did wrong. Daniel set down his toolbox and smiled, a gesture that would have been impossible 8 months ago. You didn't do anything wrong. These old machines just need some coaxing sometimes. Let me show you. As Daniel worked, explaining each step of the repair process, Marcus watched with the intense focus of someone memorizing a lifeline. Daniel recognized the look because he'd worn it himself, the desperate attention of a person who understood that second chances came with no guarantee of thirds. Christopher Lane appeared in the kitchen doorway, making his nightly rounds. But these weren't the suspicious surveillance missions of his undercover days. Now he came to check in, to listen, to learn what his people needed to do their jobs well. The staff had initially been nervous about the owner's sudden visibility, but they'd quickly learned that this version of Christopher Lane was more interested in solving problems than assigning blame. How's it going, Marcus? Christopher asked, genuinely interested in the answer. Better, sir, Marcus replied, stealing glances at Daniel's repair work. Daniel's teaching me about the equipment. Good. Learning from Daniel is like getting a master class in problem solving. Christopher meant it. Over the past weeks, he'd watched Daniel handle everything from temperamental freezers to personality conflicts with the kind of patient wisdom that couldn't be taught in business school. Elena approached, carrying a plate of the evening's special, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables, the kind of meal that had once been forbidden to staff but was now available to anyone working a shift. For Marcus, she said, setting it down at the prep station. You missed your dinner break again. Marcus stared at the plate like he couldn't quite believe it was meant for him. Are you sure? I mean, this looks expensive. Everyone eats, Elena said firmly. House rule. Daniel finished the dishwasher repair and began packing up his tools, but he paused when he saw Marcus eyeing the food uncertainly. There was something achingly familiar about the boy's hesitation, the disbelief that kindness could exist without strings attached. Moving quietly, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a brown paper bag. Inside was the same simple meal he'd once saved for Elena, a peanut butter sandwich and an apple. But now it was a choice rather than a necessity, a gesture of welcome rather than survival. He placed it next to Marcus's plate. "For later," he said simply. "In case you get hungry during the shift." Marcus looked up, confusion and gratitude warring in his young face. "Why?" Daniel considered the question seriously. A year ago, he might not have had an answer. But now he understood something that all the business books and management seminars had never taught. Wealth wasn't measured in what you accumulated, but in what you chose to give away. "Because we all need to know someone's paying attention," Daniel said. "Someone notices if we're hungry, if we're struggling, if we're trying to do better. That's worth more than money." Christopher watched this exchange from across the kitchen, and felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with witnessing unexpected grace. The numbers on his quarterly report would show that Riverside Grill was more profitable than ever. Higher employee retention, increased productivity, and word-of-mouth marketing that money couldn't buy. But the real wealth was harder to quantify. It lived in the way Elena hummed while she cooked, in Daniel's easy smile, and Marcus's slowly straightening shoulders as he began to believe he might actually belong somewhere. Later that night, as the last dishes were washed and the final tables cleaned, Christopher stood in his restaurant and felt richer than he ever had in his penthouse apartment. Real wealth, he'd learned, wasn't something you could deposit in a bank account. It was a 19-year-old kid eating dinner without fear, a former convict teaching patience and kindness, and a young woman who no longer had to choose between eating and sending money home. It was the knowledge that sometimes, the most important business decision you could make was to remember that business was really about people. And it was the simple truth that kindness, like compound interest, grew exponentially when you gave it time and space to work.